Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at Morphy's with a cool French P38. How would a P38 be French, you ask? Well, the Mauser factory was producing P38s right up until the very end of World War II. The factory was occupied by Allied troops in April of 1945. It was put under administrative control of the French government. The French, by the very next month, May of 1945, restarted production on a bunch of Mauser's product lines to supply arms for the French military. Of course, all of the French arms manufacturing had been, well, it wasn't in good shape. It had been under German control for many years. The French army needed a significant number of guns, basically anything it could get. They really didn't like depending on aid from the British and the Americans. They'd much rather provide their own guns, a little bit of better dignity in that. And so, hey, if we've got this German arms factory under our control, they're making guns for us. And the primary thing that they manufactured was the Kar-98K rifle. I have a separate video on French occupation K-98Ks. But after that, the next most popular, the next most common, the next most numerous gun produced at Mauser under occupation was the P38. Following this, by the way, they also made HSCs, or at the same time, but to a lesser extent. They made HSC pistols. They also even made Lugers at Mauser in 1945 and 46. But today we are looking at the P38, so let's dive in up close and let me show you how you can tell what makes these French. Compared to the occupation production K-98K rifles, the story of the P38 is actually fairly straightforward, and these are pretty easy to identify and to understand. So Mauser changed, of course, from the BYF code to SVW in 1945. Now, on the rifles, they would eventually go to SVW-MB. They never did that on pistols. The pistols were all marked SVW-45. German production was linear on these, unlike on the rifles, and they got to about 3000 F by the time the factory was occupied. When the French restarted production, they just skipped to the very end of the F block and started with pistol 1G. So this one, serial number 9453G, is actually very early, well, not very early, relatively early in French production, right at the end of the G block. Probably the most distinctive marking you will find on these to indicate French ownership is this 5-pointed star. That was the French acceptance stamp. They used it on the K-98Ks as well. You may recognize that from, say, Ruby pistols from World War I. Same acceptance stamp used on those. However, you will sometimes, especially on the early pistols, find various German proof marks on some of the parts as well. When the French occupied Mauser, they did an inventory of what was there, and they tallied up 85 tons of pistol parts, something like 7.3 million individual parts in various stages of manufacture. So there were a lot of leftover parts to work with, and those are the ones that they started when they began assembling new pistols for themselves. Now this particular one doesn't have any German markings on the outside, but it does have some on the inside. So let's go ahead and disassemble it. Got our standard magazine there. Lock the slide open. Open up the disassembly lever. Drop this down. Drop the hammer. And presto, the slide assembly comes off the frame. There's not really anything down in there for us to look at. I will point out that this has the wartime standard sort of black plastic grips on it. There's a mixture of grips on the French production guns. Some are like this, especially the earlier ones. They also made extensive use of a stamped sheet metal grip that was developed at Mauser during the war. It was never implemented by Mauser, well, it was never implemented under German control, but it was put into production under the French. And so you will see those sheet metal grips on the French occupation pistols sometimes. I should also point out here that on the German guns, the fire marking in the safety here was colored in. On the French guns, they're not. You get an S and an F engraved, but there's no color to them. This example is one of the large batch that were imported by Interarms. They rather discreetly put their import markings on the bottom of the slide here, so you can actually see them when the gun's assembled. A little more distinctive here. It's nicely hidden. Like if you have to put import marks, obnoxious import marks on a gun somewhere, that's not a bad location to do it. Now let's open up the locking block here, pull the barrel assembly out, and then we get this nice dichotomy of a Waffenamt stamped barrel with a French star stamped locking block. And that's exactly the sort of mixed markings that you will see on the French occupation guns. They did put the last 3 digits of the serial number here on the locking block, and we have the complete serial number here on the front of the barrel, as German production would have. Over the course of the 18 months or so that these were being put together, actually more like a year, spring 45 to spring 46, the French would number fewer and fewer parts, eventually just numbering the frames. A few other elements of this design. In 1946, the French did actually change the slide marking to SVW 46. You'll find those as well. The star is on most of these, but not strictly all of them. There's a lot of sort of flexibility in the rules regarding these. There is a mixture of parkerized and blued components, sometimes even on the same gun. You can get some that are sort of two-tone in appearance. Like I said, the grips, some were plastic, some were sheet metal. In terms of serial numbers, the French would manufacture a complete run for the G, H, and I serial number blocks. They then started in on K in 1946. They didn't actually finish K, and then there was a small batch of L, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right, nothing particularly exotic in the disassembly here. This is mechanically identical to all of the standard wartime P38s. The French would put these to good use. They were used in particular by colonial and airborne troops. A lot of them went to Indochina. This pistol dates from that period where France was clearly looking towards the 9mm parabellum cartridge as the obvious new standard to go with, but they had not yet actually adopted or begun production of any 9mm pistols or submachine guns of their own. And so there would actually be a fair amount of German war material used in the immediate post-war years by the French. 98Ks, MG42s, MP40s, and P38s, among others. This is a pistol that has unfortunately gotten itself an obnoxious marketing nickname, and that is the Grey Ghost. That name comes to us courtesy of Interarms. They imported a big batch of these several decades ago. They were looking for a catchy marketing name, and they came up with Grey Ghost because a lot of the guns had gray grips and a sort of grayish parkerized finish. And Ghost, I guess, sounds exciting. I presume it sounds more exciting to most of their target market than French occupation P38. So that's what they went with. You'll still see that name referenced occasionally. Thank you, Interarms. Really appreciate it. Same goes for the Black Widow Lugers. Anyway, in total, the French would manufacture 38,780 of these pistols under their control of Mauser. This went on until the late spring, early summer of 1946, at which point it became clear that they could not continue to produce guns at Mauser. There was an agreement that had been signed amongst the Allied powers not to produce arms on German soil. And so the French took the completed pistols that they had. They blew up many of the Mauser factory complex buildings, largely out of spite. And they did take a batch of parts for 500 more pistols back to France with them. Those went to Chatellerault, where they were assembled there. That was the L block of guns. There are some differences about the L block. I'll do a separate video on them specifically later, but the last 500 guns were actually assembled in France from German-made parts made under French administration. Anyway, this is a particularly early one. It has early grips on it, SVW 45. So a cool example to take a look at. We'll follow this up with a video on the very last batch of the French occupation P38s. Big thanks to Morphees for giving me the opportunity to film this one and show it to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.